In the heart of a small, unassuming town lies a street most would describe as picturesque. Brick sidewalks, historic lamp posts, and colorful awnings shading local shops. But there's one building that never seems to belong. It sits on the corner, its chipped wooden sign reading Moonlight Coffee Shop. At a glance, it looks inviting. A warm glow emanates from its windows, and the aroma of roasted beans often drifts out to the street. For years, people have stopped by for a drink or a bite. Yet, for every cheerful patron who walks in, there are whispers of those who never come out the same. There's something about the Moonlight Coffee Shop that feels wrong. Locals claim it's cursed. Some say it's haunted. Others refuse to talk about it at all. But every story, every rumor, points to one thing. No one truly understands the horror that dwells within those walls. Tonight, we'll uncover the dark and twisted history of this cursed cafe. From its origins in the late 19th century to the terrifying events that unfolded in recent years. This isn't just a story, it's a warning. The story of the Moonlight Coffee Shop begins in 1894, when Thomas and Margaret Ellsworth arrived in town. The Ellsworths were newcomers, looking to start fresh after a string of failed ventures. They purchased a corner lot and opened a bakery, which they name Ellsworth's Fine Breads and Pastries. From the beginning, the bakery was a success. The townsfolk marveled at their recipes. Cakes that seemed to melt in your mouth, breads with flavors no one could replicate. But as their fame grew, so did whispers about the couple. They were polite but distant. Thomas rarely spoke, and Margaret was often seen staring out the window, as if watching for something or someone. After about a year, things began to change. Regular customers complained of headaches after visiting the bakery. Some described unsettling dreams they couldn't explain, dreams of fire, darkness, and the sound of grinding, like metal against stone. Then there was the couple's sudden obsession with an ornate coffee grinder Thomas had imported from Europe. It became the centerpiece of their shop, displayed prominently behind the counter. Margaret often polished it, her eyes fixed on its intricate carvings. One evening, tragedy struck. The bakery burned to the ground, the flames consuming everything but the coffee grinder. Investigators found it among the ashes, pristine and untouched. Margaret claimed it was a miracle, but others weren't so sure. In the following weeks, Thomas began to withdraw. Neighbors reported hearing arguments late at night, Margaret's voice rising in anger, followed by long stretches of silence. And then, one morning, Margaret was found dead in the basement of their rebuilt shop. The coroner could find no clear cause of death, but Thomas swore he had seen her speaking to someone before she died, a man whose description matched no one in town. Thomas left town shortly after, abandoning the bakery and leaving behind more questions than answers. But the story didn't end there. Over the years, the building was sold, repurposed, and reopened as different businesses, yet the pattern never changed. Each owner reported strange occurrences. Objects moving on their own, sudden chills, and a pervasive sense of unease. One owner claimed to have seen Margaret's reflection in a window, staring back at him from behind the counter. Fast forward to 2021. The Moonlight Coffee Shop, as it was now called, had been vacant for nearly 5 years. That's when Sarah Hayes, a young entrepreneur with a dream of running her own cafe, purchased the property. Sarah wasn't from the area and knew little of the building's history. Locals warned her, of course. They spoke of disappearances, strange lights, and a curse that had plagued the property for over a century. But Sarah dismissed their concerns, chalking it up to small-town superstition. First, business boomed. Sarah's renovations transformed the old cafe into a trendy spot, complete with modern decor and artisan coffee. Customers poured in, praising the atmosphere and the unique charm of the space. But soon, the cracks began to show. Employees started reporting odd occurrences. Glasses shattering without reason, cold drafts in the middle of summer, and strange noises late at night. One barista, Jenna, claimed she heard someone whisper her name while she was cleaning up after closing. She laughed it off at first, but the whispers grew louder over time. One night, Jenna stayed late to finish some paperwork. Security footage showed her walking between tables, tidying up. Then, without warning, she froze. Her head turned slowly, as if listening to something no one else could hear. She walked toward the counter, out of view of the camera. That was the last time anyone saw her. Her car remained parked outside, her keys and belongings untouched. Sarah reviewed the footage dozens of times, trying to understand what happened. In the background, faint whispers could be heard on the audio, whispers that grew louder as Jenna disappeared. Determined to get answers, Sarah hired Peter Graves, a local historian, to investigate the property. Peter's research uncovered chilling details. Records of a hidden basement beneath the cafe, where Margaret Ellsworth had been found dead. Together, Sarah and Peter decided to explore the basement, armed with flashlights and cameras. What they found was more than they'd bargained for. The walls were covered in carvings, symbols that Peter identified as ritualistic. In the center of the room sat the coffee grinder, dusty but undisturbed. Sarah reached out to touch it, but Peter stopped her, warning that they didn't know what they were dealing with. After discovering the basement and the untouched coffee grinder, Sarah became consumed by the mystery. The once successful entrepreneur was now plagued by nightmares, dark, vivid dreams of the cafe, of Margaret Ellsworth standing behind the counter, her lips moving as though she were reciting something. But the words never reached Sarah's ears. The grinder featured prominently in her dreams, its intricate carvings shifting and moving as if alive. Peter, too, was affected. While reviewing footage from their time in the basement, he noticed faint shapes in the corners of the frame, shadowy figures that seemed to watch them. The audio picked up faint grinding sounds, though they hadn't touched the grinder. Determined to break the curse, Peter began researching the symbols on the walls. He learned they were tied to ancient rituals meant to bind or trap entities. What if Margaret and Thomas had tried to contain something? And what if it had failed? Sarah's behavior grew erratic. Her employees quit, leaving her alone in the cafe. Customers dwindled, sensing the oppressive atmosphere that now filled the space. One evening, Sarah decided to take matters into her own hands. Armed with a sledgehammer, she descended into the basement, determined to destroy the grinder once and for all. Peter begged her to wait, insisting they didn't understand what they were dealing with. But Sarah was resolute. She raised the hammer, brought it down with all her strength, and the grinder didn't so much as dent. As the hammer struck, the room seemed to shift. The walls grew darker, the symbols glowing faintly. A sound began to echo, a low, guttural noise that grew louder, filling their ears until they were forced to cover them. Sarah dropped the hammer and stumbled back. In that moment, the grinder began to hum, its carvings twisting as if alive. The air grew cold, and Sarah screamed, claiming she saw Margaret standing in the corner, her face blank but her eyes fixed on her. Peter grabbed Sarah and dragged her upstairs. The two locked the basement door, barricading it with furniture. But the noises didn't stop. They could hear whispers seeping through the walls, growing louder with each passing moment. The grinder, it seemed, was no longer content to stay hidden. That night, Sarah decided there was only one way to end it. She would burn the cafe to the ground. She doused the floors in gasoline, tears streaming down her face. Peter tried to stop her, pleading with her to think it through, but Sarah was beyond reason. She struck a match, dropped it, and fled the building as flames consumed it. From across the street, Sarah and Peter watched the fire rage. The cafe's windows shattered, flames licking at the walls. But then, something strange happened. In the center of the inferno, the grinder sat untouched, its surface glowing faintly. The flames seemed to bend around it, refusing to destroy it. Sarah screamed, and Peter pulled her back, trying to shield her from the sight. When the fire finally burned out, investigators combed through the rubble. They found no sign of Sarah, though Peter swore she had been standing beside him the entire time. The grinder was gone, as though it had vanished into thin air, and the basement, though charred, remained largely intact. Months passed, and the lot where the Moonlight coffee shop once stood became overgrown with weeds. Townsfolk avoided it, though some claimed to see strange lights at night. Others spoke of hearing grinding noises echoing from the empty lot. Peter, shaken but alive, moved away, refusing to speak of what had happened. He left behind his notes, filled with sketches of the symbols in the basement and theories about the grinder. But none of it explained the horrors they had witnessed. Sarah was never found. Some believe she fled, unable to face what she'd unleashed. Others think she was claimed by whatever force had cursed the cafe. To this day, no one knows for sure. But the story doesn't end there. A few months after the fire, a new cafe opened in a nearby city. It was sleek, modern, and completely unassuming except for one detail. On the counter, as part of the decor, sat an antique coffee grinder. Customers praised its charm, marveling at the intricate carvings. But the owner began to notice strange things. Customers would stare at the grinder for minutes at a time, as if entranced. Employees reported hearing faint whispers late at night. And then, one day, a barista disappeared, leaving behind only a faint trail of coffee grounds leading out the door. The Moonlight coffee shop may be gone, but its curse lingers. The grinder, it seems, cannot be destroyed. And as long as it exists, the question remains, how many more lives will it claim? If you ever find yourself in a small cafe, sipping coffee while admiring a beautiful antique grinder, ask yourself, do you feel safe, or is something watching you? The story of Cold Cliff Hall was one the locals of Frost Hollow refused to tell. Perched on a frozen hill, the abandoned manor had stood untouched for nearly a century, its windows dark and its gates rusted shut. In the bitter cold of January, when the snow buried the roads and the wind howled through the valley, Cold Cliff seemed alive, its shadow looming over the town like a specter. The legend began on a January night in 1897, when the last owner of the manor, Elias Winters, threw a lavish party to celebrate his fortune. Wealthy guests arrived from across the region, dressed in their finest, and the halls of Cold Cliff echoed with music and laughter. But as the night wore on, a storm descended upon the valley, trapping the guests inside. By morning, the house was silent, the windows frosted over. When townsfolk finally forced their way inside, they found no sign of Elias or his guests. The ballroom was empty, the dining tables untouched, and the only sound was the faint creak of the wind through the rafters. Over the years, rumors of hauntings plagued Cold Cliff. Travelers claimed to hear faint music drifting from its halls at night, and children swore they saw figures moving past its windows. But no one dared enter the manor, not even the bravest or most foolhardy. It was a place best left alone, until January 12th, when the Frost Hollow Historical Society decided to investigate. The team, led by historian Anna Voss, arrived at Cold Cliff on a gray, overcast afternoon. Their goal was to document the manor's history, uncover its secrets, and perhaps solve the mystery of Elias Winters and his vanished guests. They carried cameras, audio recorders, and thermal equipment, determined to leave no stone unturned. As they approached the gates, the wind picked up, and the temperature seemed to drop even further. Anna paused, staring up at the towering structure. "This place has been waiting for us," she said quietly. Inside, the air was colder than the weather outside, and a layer of frost coated the floors and walls. The grandeur of the manor was undeniable. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, and marble staircases spiraled upward. But the beauty was marred by decay. Paint peeled from the walls, furniture lay broken and scattered, and a faint smell of damp and decay lingered in the air. As the team set up their equipment, Anna couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As dusk fell, the temperature dropped further, and the first recording device picked up an anomaly. A faint, rhythmic sound, like footsteps echoing in an empty hallway. When Anna played back the audio, a voice whispered faintly over the static, "Why have you come?" As night fell, the manor's silence deepened, broken only by the faint hum of the wind outside. The team gathered in the main hall, reviewing the recordings from earlier. The whispered voice they captured was undeniable, and its message left them uneasy. But Anna urged them to press on. "We came here for answers," she said. "Let's find them." The team split into pairs to explore different parts of the house. Anna and her assistant, Mark, took the East Wing, where the Manor's library was said to hold records of Elias Winter's life. The others headed toward the ballroom, hoping to capture evidence of the legendary ghostly music. As they moved deeper into the manor, the air grew colder, and the frost on the walls thickened, forming strange, swirling patterns that seemed almost deliberate. In the library, Anna and Mark discovered rows of books covered in frost, their spines cracked and illegible. But one book stood out, a leather-bound journal resting on a desk near the window. The pages were brittle, but Anna carefully flipped through them, her breath fogging the air. The journal belonged to Elias Winters, and its entries detailed the weeks leading up to the fateful night of his party. The final entry was chilling. "The whispers are louder now. They come with the cold, promising wealth and power if I open the doors to them. They say the ice will bind us, but I fear the price." Meanwhile, in the ballroom, the other team set up their audio recorders and motion sensors. The room was vast, its high ceilings adorned with frozen chandeliers that glittered like crystal. As they worked, faint music began to play, soft and distant, like the echoes of a forgotten waltz. The team froze, their eyes darting around the room. Then, one by one, the chandeliers began to sway, as though moved by an unseen hand. The music grew louder, and the air turned frigid, their breaths forming clouds. One of the team members, Lisa, pointed to the far corner. "There's someone there," she whispered. A figure stood in the shadows, watching them. As the team's flashlight beams swept across the ballroom, the figure vanished, leaving only a patch of frost where it had stood. The music stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. The journal's final entry haunted Anna as she and Mark returned to the main hall to regroup with the others. The mention of whispers and a promise of wealth reminded her of the tales she'd heard about Elias Winters, that he had gained his fortune overnight, seemingly by magic. But the journal hinted at a darker truth, a bargain made in desperation, one that came at a terrible cost. The team reconvened, sharing their experiences. The figure in the ballroom, the ghostly music, and the strange patterns in the frost were all unsettling enough. But it was the recordings that truly terrified them. Every device had captured the same phenomenon. Whispers that overlapped and echoed, speaking in a language none of them could understand. And beneath the voices was a single, recurring word: stay. Determined to uncover the truth, Anna led the team to the basement, where the manor's records were rumored to be stored. The descent was treacherous. The stairs were coated in ice, and the air grew colder with each step. The basement was vast, its walls lined with shelves that had long since rotted. But at the center of the room stood a large, ornate chest, its surface covered in frost. The chest contained documents and letters, many of them too damaged to read. But one letter, sealed with Elias Winter's crest, was intact. It was addressed to an unknown recipient and described a ritual to summon the Winter Host, a group of entities that granted power in exchange for servitude. The letter warned of the consequences of breaking the pact: eternal entrapment in ice, bound to the manor forever. As Anna read the letter aloud, the frost on the walls began to spread, creeping toward them like living tendrils. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, filling the air with overlapping voices. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged, A man dressed in 19th century attire, his face pale and frostbitten. It was Elias Winters. Elias raised a hand, and the frost on the floor surged toward the team, freezing their feet in place. His voice was cold and hollow as he spoke. "You shouldn't have come." The frost spread rapidly, binding the team in place as Elias Winters stepped closer. His face was a frozen mask of despair, his eyes clouded and lifeless. "You've awakened them," he said, his voice a blend of regret and warning. "They have waited too long, and now they will not be denied." Anna struggled against the ice, holding her feet, her breath fogging the frigid air. "What did you do, Elias?" she demanded, her voice shaking. Elias's gaze turned to her, a flicker of something human in his expression. Elias began to speak, his words slow and deliberate. He recounted the fateful night of his party, the whispers that promised wealth and power, and the ritual he performed to summon the winter host. Desperate to save his failing fortune, he had opened the gates to entities bound by cold and shadow. They granted his wish, but their price was eternal servitude. When he tried to break the pact, the winter host claimed him and his guests, binding their souls to the manor and trapping them in an endless winter. As Elias spoke, the frost around him seemed to pulse, a living extension of the winter host's power. "They are here now," he said. "They will not let you leave." The room grew darker, and from the frost-covered walls, figures began to emerge. They were gaunt and hollow-eyed, their forms cloaked in ice that cracked and shifted with every step. The air filled with their whispers, a cacophony of overlapping voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Anna reached for the journal and the letter they had recovered, her mind racing for a solution. The letter mentioned a way to banish the winter host, but it required an offering, something of equal value to what Elias had given. As she read the words aloud, the figures halted, their whispers silencing for a moment. Elias turned to her, his face contorted with fear. "You don't understand," he said. "They will take more than you can give." The frost surged again, and the figures of the winter host closed in. One reached for Mark, its icy hand inches from his face. Anna shouted the final words of the ritual she had pieced together from the letter, and the room was flooded with blinding white light. When the light faded, the figures of the winter host were gone, and the frost around the team had receded. But the air was still heavy, and Elias remained, his expression grim. "You think you've stopped them," he said, "but they will not leave empty-handed." His words proved true as the room began to tremble. The frost on the walls condensed into sharp icicles, and the whispers returned, louder than before. The winter host had not been banished. They were enraged. Anna realized that the ritual she performed had only paused the host's advance. To truly banish them, she needed to complete the offering. But what could equal the price of the souls bound to the manor for over a century? Her thoughts were interrupted by a loud crack as the floor beneath them began to split, revealing a dark void filled with swirling snow and shadows. "We have to leave," Mark shouted, but Elias shook his head. "There is no escape," he said. "Not unless you give them what they want." Desperate, Anna turned to Elias. "What did they take from you?" she asked. He hesitated, then replied, "My legacy, my name, my soul. They left me as nothing more than a memory bound to this place." His voice grew softer. "But if you offer them something they desire more, they may let you go." Anna thought of the journal and the letter, the history and power they contained. Could that be enough? She retrieved the items and stepped to the edge of the void. "Take these," she said, her voice firm. "Take the truth of what happened here." The shadows swirled upward, wrapping around the journal and letter, pulling them into the void. For a moment, the whispers stopped, and the room grew still. But then a single voice spoke, deep and resonant. "Not enough." The frost surged again, and the figures of the winter host began to reappear. Anna's heart sank. They wanted more. They wanted someone, Elias stepped forward, his expression resolute. "I brought this upon us," he said. "Let me finish it." Before anyone could stop him, he stepped into the void. The room shook violently as the shadows consumed him, and the frost began to recede. The void closed with a deafening crack, and the frost covering the room melted into water that pooled on the floor. The air warmed slightly, and the oppressive whispers of the winter host faded into silence. Anna and the remaining team members stood in stunned disbelief, their breaths coming in short, visible gasps. Cold Cliff Hall had gone quiet, the icy grip of the winter host finally broken. But their victory felt hollow. They made their way back to the main hall, the once grand interior now showing signs of thawing. The chandeliers dripped with melting frost, and the marble floors glistened with water. Outside, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, casting the manor in a pale golden light. But the sense of unease lingered. Anna couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left unresolved. As they exited the manor, Anna turned back for one final look. In the highest window of the east wing, she saw a figure standing, Elias Winters, his face no longer frostbitten but calm and almost grateful. He raised a hand in farewell before fading into the light. The gates of Cold Cliff groaned as they swung shut behind the team, as if sealing the manor's secrets for good. The team returned to Frost Hollow, shaken but alive. Anna documented everything they had experienced, but the journal and letter were gone, consumed by the void. Cold Cliff Hall remained abandoned, its windows dark once more. And though the winter host had been banished, the townsfolk knew better than to venture near the manor. In the depths of winter, when the wind howled and the frost crept up the hills, they whispered of Cold Cliff Hall and the sacrifice that had saved them all. Cold Cliff Hall stands to this day, a relic of a forgotten era. Travelers passing through Frost Hollow sometimes report seeing lights in its windows and hearing faint music carried on the wind. And for those brave enough to approach, the frost on its gates feels unnaturally cold, as though the winter host is waiting, watching, biding its time.